The storm had been building for 6 hours before anyone admitted it was going to kill them. Master Sergeant Garrett Holt watched the snow come in sideways across the ridge and said nothing. He had been watching weather like this his whole life, the kind that moves with a kind of deliberate intelligence, closing gaps, sealing routes, making decisions that men think only men can make. He had grown up in Montana. He knew what the mountains thought of human plans. He pulled his balaclava up and scanned the tree line below him through his scope. 4 men, his men, moving through the snow in a loose wedge, 3 meters between each, exactly as he had taught them. Specialist Drew Callum at the front, reading the ground, Sergeant Briggs on the left flank, Sergeant Farrow covering the rear. Between them, wrapped in civilian cold weather gear and moving with the stiff, deliberate steps of a man entirely out of his element, the man Holt had been tasked to deliver alive to a forward handoff point 40 kilometers north. The man had a name. Holt had already forgotten it. He referred to him in his own mind simply as the package. 4 years in Delta Force had taught him that names were a kind of attachment, and attachments were weight. And in the Cascades in January, you carried nothing you did not absolutely need. The handoff point was 6 kilometers out. The terrain between here and there was dense Douglas fir, 2 creek crossings, and a ridgeline that the map marked as passable but that Holt suspected the map had never actually visited. Visibility was dropping. Temperature was already minus 19 Celsius and falling. Communications had been intermittent since 1400 hours, something the mountains did to radio signals with the same casual indifference they applied to everything else. Holt had lost satellite link 40 minutes ago and had not yet recovered it. He was operating on terrain awareness and dead reckoning in 22 years of doing exactly this in exactly these conditions. He dropped from his overwatch position and moved to join the group. That was when the shooting started. It came from 3 directions simultaneously, which told Holt 2 things immediately. Whoever was out there had planned this, and they had planned it well. The first burst raked across the snow 10 meters to Callum's left. The second burst came from upslope to the right, cutting off the obvious retreat route. The third, and this one was the one that scared him, came from directly ahead, from inside the tree line, from men who had been lying in that snow long enough to be invisible, long enough to be cold all the way to the bone, long enough that this was not an ambush of opportunity, but an ambush of preparation. Holt was moving before his conscious mind had finished processing. Contact, front, and flanks. Spread and find cover, now. The team moved. They had practiced this enough times that the bodies knew what to do without waiting for the brain. Callum went left, hard, sliding behind a deadfall. Briggs went prone and began returning fire toward the upslope position. Farrow grabbed the package by the collar and physically threw him behind a boulder, then took up position on the right. Good men. All of them. Holt had chosen them himself. But the fire kept coming. He counted muzzle flashes. 8 positions at minimum. Maybe 10. The geometry was bad, the angles were bad, and the ground between his team and any viable cover was 40 meters of open slope that might as well have been 1,000 miles. Briggs was doing damage. Holt could hear the return fire finding the upslope position, heard at least one grunt of impact. But the volume of incoming was still overwhelming. Farrow was pinned, Callum was pinned, the package was flat behind his boulder and had gone perfectly, blessedly silent, which was the one thing a civilian in this situation could usefully do. Holt got behind a thick fir trunk and ran the numbers. They were not good numbers. He keyed his radio. Static. He tried the alternate frequency. More static. The storm had eaten communications completely, and he was 6 kilometers from any friendly position with 4 men, 1 civilian, and a steadily shrinking perimeter of safe ground. He was not afraid. He had been in worse places. But he was honest enough with himself to recognize that the math right now did not favor him. Callum, he called. Count. I see 8, Callum called back, his voice flat and controlled in the way that the best soldiers learned to keep it. Maybe 2 more in the far trees. They're trying to walk us toward the creek. Holt had already seen it. The fire patterns were designed to push them south toward the frozen creek, toward ground that would break under their boots and slow them to nothing. Someone on the other side of this fight had looked at this terrain and thought about it carefully. That meant someone on the other side of this fight was not just a trigger puller. He made his decision. On my mark, we break north. Briggs and I suppress the upslope position. Callum, you take the package and you run. Farrow, trail. Don't stop for anything. Understood, Callum said. Ready, Briggs said. He drew breath. He opened his mouth to give the order. And then the first shot came from the east. It did not sound like the other shots. The other shots were the short, businesslike crack of rifles at close range, the sound filling the space between the trees and bouncing off the snow in confused echoes. This shot was different. It was singular. It came from far away, far enough that the sound arrived a fraction of a second after the effect, which was a man on the upslope position sitting down very suddenly in the snow, very completely. In the way that men only sat down when the decision was no longer theirs to make. Holt had his scope up before the second shot came. 2 seconds later, another man down. Different position. The geometry of the shot was wrong for anyone in his group. The angle, the elevation, the distance. Whoever was doing this was not in the fight. Whoever was doing this was above the fight, looking down at it the way a chess player looks down at a board. The third shot, 4 seconds of silence first, then the crack and impact arriving almost together, which meant the shooter was closer than Holt had initially estimated. Closest target selected this time, the man at the 2 o'clock position who had been doing the most effective work against Pharaoh's position. Down. Holt watched the Iron Veil force react, and the reaction told him everything. These were not green fighters. They didn't panic. They didn't expose themselves trying to locate the new threat. They went to ground professionally, the way soldiers do when they understand that the geometry of a fight has just changed and they need a moment to recalculate. But a moment was all it took. Callum was already moving. Briggs laid down a long, suppressing burst. Holt sprinted across the open ground to the boulder where Pharaoh had the package pinned, grabbed the man's arm, bam, his arm, and pulled him upright. Move, Holt said. North, don't look back. The package moved. The fourth and fifth shots came in the next 90 seconds, precise and deliberate, pulling the Iron Veil attention east and buying the team the cover they needed. By the time the firing stopped entirely, Holt's team was 300 meters north, inside the tree line, moving hard. He did not stop them for 4 minutes. When he finally raised a fist and the team froze, everyone was breathing hard except Holt, who had spent the last 4 minutes running the numbers on what had just happened and had arrived at a conclusion that made no sense at all. Sit rep, he said quietly. Briggs took a graze on the shoulder, Callum reported, bleeding but mobile. Package is unhurt. Pharaoh and I are clean. He paused. Someone pulled us out of there. Yes, Holt said. Who? Holt did not answer. He turned east toward the direction the shots had come from. The slope rose steeply there, a wall of fir and granite climbing toward a ridgeline that disappeared into the cloud. Somewhere up there, at a distance he estimated at not less than 700 meters, in a storm, in failing light, in wind, someone had put down 5 targets in under 2 minutes without a single miss, without a single round that came anywhere near the people being protected. 700 meters, in that wind, with that visibility. He had only ever known one person who could do that. Get Briggs patched and keep the package warm, Holt said. I'll be back in 10 minutes. Where are you going? Callum asked. East, Holt said. He moved alone up the slope, cutting at an angle, following the trajectory of the shots backward through the geometry of the fight. He had learned to do this in sniper school at Fort Bragg 20 years ago and had never forgotten how. You followed the line. You found where the line originated. It took him 6 minutes. The position was exactly where he had calculated it would be. A flat shelf of granite behind a natural snow berm, invisible from below with a clear sight line down through a narrow gap in the trees to the entire ambush site. It was not a lucky position. It was a studied position, chosen by someone who had looked at this terrain and understood it, who had known where the ambush would happen before the ambush happened, who had been here long enough to let their body temperature drop to match the stone they were lying on. The snow on the shelf was compressed, but not packed. Someone had lain here for a long time. Someone who knew how to be still. 3 spent casings, not scattered, arranged, placed with deliberate care into a triangle, each one touching the others, nested together with a precision that was not practical, but ceremonial. The caliber was .300 Winchester Magnum. The casings were clean. There was no other trace, no boot prints leading away, no disturbed snow on any of the departure routes, no thread caught on bark, no impression in the softer snow at the shelf's edge. Holt crouched over the 3 casings for a long time. He had not seen this exact arrangement in 4 years. but he remembered it perfectly. He had asked about it once, years ago, early in his career when he was still asking questions he did not yet know were stupid. She had looked at him with a particular patience she reserved for men who were smart enough to ask, but not yet experienced enough to understand. And she had said, 3 shots to end an ambush. You leave the casing so whoever finds them knows it was deliberate. So they know it wasn't luck. He had asked why the triangle. She had almost smiled, because luck doesn't make triangles. Callum was wrong. She was not KIA. He had signed the paperwork himself. He had stood in a cold administrative building at Joint Base Lewis McChord and pressed his pen to the line that read, "Confirmed killed in action." And he had not hesitated because he had been told she was gone, and he had believed it because the alternative, that she was alive somewhere and had not come back, was a thought he had not been willing to carry. He picked up one of the casings and held it in his gloved palm. He knew this pattern. He knew this distance. He knew this choice of caliber and this choice of position and this arrangement of spent brass on cold granite. He knew exactly who had been lying on the shelf. When he got back to the team, Callum had Briggs sitting against a tree with his jacket open, working on the shoulder wound with practiced efficiency. The package was on the ground, knees drawn up, staring at nothing with the expression of a man revising his understanding of his own life. Farah was on the perimeter, watching the tree line. Holt crouched next to Callum and kept his voice below the wind. What do you know about a shooter called Wraith? Callum looked up from the wound he was dressing. His hand stopped moving for just a moment. Then he resumed. Staff Sergeant Mara Teslin, he said, best long-range shooter the Army's produced in the last 20 years. According to the people who track these things, M201 OESR primary, Barrett M107 when she needed the reach. 2 tours in Afghanistan, 1 in Syria. Confirmed kills at ranges that most snipers don't attempt as training exercises. He paused. KIA 4 years ago, Cascade range. Helicopter went down in a firefight. Nobody recovered. Nobody recovered, Holt repeated. Callum looked at him. He was 29 years old and sharp in the way that the best young soldiers were sharp. Not just technically proficient, but perceptive, reading situations and people with an attention that went beyond training. He looked at Holt's face. Then he looked at the spent casing in Holt's palm. Then he looked back at Holt's face. Sergeant, he said carefully, the body was never recovered. No, Holt said, it wasn't. Callum was quiet for a moment, then. Staff Sergeant Teslin always left 3 casings when she finished a position. Everyone who ever served with her knows that. It's in the written accounts. It's practically her signature. Another pause. There are 3 casings up there, aren't there? Yes, Holt said. Briggs opened his eyes. He had been listening. Ghost story, he said. His voice was tight with pain, but his mind was still working. She's dead. I've heard that story 3 times in the last 2 years, and it's always the same. Someone finds something that looks like her pattern and starts the legend all over again. Maybe Hote. He did not believe it. He had known Teslin Mara for 4 years before she was declared dead. He had served 2 deployments with her. He had watched her work at distances and in conditions that made other qualified snipers stop and simply stare. He had seen what she left behind and what she took with her and how she moved through terrain. He knew what her work looked like the way a man knows the handwriting of someone he has read letters from for years. The casing he was holding had been placed there by Mara Teslin. He was certain of this. What he did not know, what he could not yet answer, was why. He pocketed the casing and stood. We move in 5. Briggs, can you carry? Yes, Briggs said. Then we move. He was checking the package's condition when he saw it, attached to the bark of the fir tree directly behind where the package had been crouching, not visible from any angle except this one, which required standing precisely where Holt was now standing, which meant it had been placed here for him specifically, which meant she had known he would look for exactly this, which meant she had known he was here, which meant she had been watching them for long enough to know who was who and where each person would be. A piece of paper, folded once, attached to the bark with a KA-bar combat knife. He recognized the knife immediately. He had given it to her himself, standing in a cold parking lot at Fort Bragg after her final sniper qualification. He had pressed it into her hands and told her she had earned it, and she had looked at it for a moment and then looked at him and said that she intended to use it. Her name was etched into the handle grip, small and precise, done with a tool rather than scratched in. Teslin. The knife was in perfect condition. 4 years in the Cascades, and it looked like it had been cleaned and oiled the night before. He unfolded the paper. 2 words. Her handwriting. He remembered her handwriting from years of mission logs and equipment manifests and the brief, dense notes she left in operational binders. Precise, angular, no wasted space. Don't follow. He read it twice. Then he raised his eyes to the ridgeline above and to the east, where the slope broke over a granite lip and disappeared against the low gray sky. She was there. He didn't see her. No one ever saw her unless she allowed it. But he felt the fact of her presence the way you feel someone watching you in a dark room. A shift in the quality of the air, a subtle weight that the space didn't have before. He had felt it before, years ago, when they had trained together and he had tried to find her in a scenario and failed every time, and she had stepped out of the brush 3 feet behind him and said quietly that he had been looking in the right direction, but at the wrong elevation. He looked up. She was on the granite lip, 400 meters above him, just standing, still as the stone she stood on. Not hiding, standing the way a person stands when they want to be seen just enough to confirm the message was received. She wore a ghillie suit of her own construction, white and gray, perfectly matched to the winter slope, so that the human silhouette was almost an illusion. You saw it because you knew to look, not because she had allowed herself to be visible. She looked at him for 3 seconds. Then she stepped back, and the ridgeline was empty, and there was no mark in the snow that Holt could see from where he stood to indicate that anyone had ever been there at all. Callum appeared at his shoulder. He had followed Holt's gaze up the slope. He saw nothing, nothing to see, but he saw the direction Holt was looking, and he looked at the knife in Holt's hand with her name on it, and he said nothing, which was exactly the right thing to say. Holt folded the note and put it in his pocket. He reversed the knife and offered it handle first to Callum. "Hold this," he said. "Don't lose it." "Yes, Sergeant," Callum said. He took the knife with both hands, which was not standard operating procedure for handling a piece of equipment, but was absolutely the right thing to do. They moved north. The storm deepened. The temperature dropped another 4 degrees in the following hour, and the wind came up hard from the northwest, driving snow horizontally through the trees and reducing visibility to 30 meters. They moved in silence, Holt at the front now, reading the ground, the trees, the air. He was thinking about 2 words written in precise angular handwriting. He was thinking about a 3-second window on a ridgeline 400 meters up. He was thinking about a woman who had been declared dead 4 years ago and who had apparently spent those 4 years doing something in these mountains, alone, in conditions that would kill an ordinary person inside a week. He was thinking about why she had come back, not to him specifically. He was careful not to flatter himself with that interpretation. She had come back to the ambush site. She had been watching the area. She had known an ambush was going to happen, or had at minimum been positioned to respond to one, which suggested she had been tracking the same elements that had just tried to kill his team. She had intervened. She had left her signature. She had shown herself for exactly long enough to confirm she was real and not a hallucination brought on by cold and stress. And then she had told him in 2 words not to follow, which raised a question he did not yet have enough information to answer. What was she doing here that she did not want him to interfere with? They established a temporary shelter in a dense stand of fir at the base of a north-facing slope, using the trees and a thermal tarp to cut the wind and bring the temperature inside the little enclosure up to something the human body could negotiate with. The package had stopped talking, which Holt was grateful for. Briggs was fading. Not dangerously, the wound was clean, but blood loss and cold together had his systems running below full. And Pharaoh got him horizontal and wrapped in everything spare that wasn't needed for immediate operational use. Holt sat on his pack at the edge of the shelter with his back to the wind and his eyes on the tree line and thought about what came next. What came next arrived on a frequency he had not expected. His radio crackled, not his primary set, which was still eating static from the storm's interference. His secondary, a ruggedized unit he carried on his left hip that operated on a different band, encryption capable, rarely used. It crackled and then resolved into a voice, female, clipped, professional, braiding with the careful neutrality of someone who had been trained to give nothing away over an open channel. November 7 actual. This is Voss. I have you on visual. Authenticate Foxtrot Niner Blue. Holt found his authentication card. He read back the countersign. There was a pause. Authentication confirmed. I'm 200 meters to your northeast. I'm coming in. Tell your people not to shoot me. Stand by, Holt said. He turned to the shelter. We have a friendly inbound from the northeast. 200 meters. I'll call her in. No one shoots anything until I say so. Callum looked at him. Her? 200 meters, Holt said. She came in from exactly the direction she had said, which told him she had been watching them long enough to take a compass bearing. She was dressed in civilian cold weather gear, the kind serious mountaineers wore, not the kind weekend hikers wore, with no visible insignia and nothing that announced military affiliation. She moved through the snow with a competence that was not quite military, but was adjacent to it. The movement of someone who had spent significant time in difficult terrain and had learned through genuine experience rather than training alone. She was in her early 40s, dark-eyed, carrying herself with a directness that stopped just short of aggression. She carried a radio and nothing that looked like a weapon, though Holt suspected that assessment was incomplete. She stopped at the edge of the shelter and looked at Holt. Chief Warrant Officer Renata Voss, Defense Intelligence Agency, I need to speak with you alone. Holt studied her for a moment. Identification. She produced it. He checked it against the authentication they had already completed on radio and against his own memory of DIA identification formatting, which was not comprehensive but was sufficient. He nodded toward the trees. 2 minutes, he told Callum. Watch the package. He walked with Voss 30 meters into the trees, far enough for privacy, close enough that he could hear anything that happened in the shelter. They stopped and stood in the way that people stand when they have important things to say and limited time to say them. She did not waste any of it. Your mission today was not a routine personnel transfer, she said. I was told it was a routine transfer. You were told what you needed to know to move the package from point to point. What you were not told is that the package's knowledge, specifically his knowledge of the infrastructure laid down in this mountain range during the Cold War, is what Iron Veil has been trying to acquire for 14 months. She paused. Iron Veil, you've encountered them today. What was waiting for you in that ambush was not a random hostile element. They knew your route. They knew your timeline. Someone in your chain of command told them both. Holt said nothing. He was filing this information and simultaneously watching her face for tells, for the particular micro-expressions that people produce when they are constructing rather than reporting. He saw none. She was telling him the truth, or she was very good at lying, and people who were very good at lying did not typically lead with the specific, verifiable claim that someone in his chain of command had burned him. Iron Veil, he said. What are they? A paramilitary force under the effective command of a man named Warren Ashby, former Special Forces, Colonel retired, operating in this range for approximately 18 months that we can verify, longer if the early intelligence holds. She paused again, and this time the pause had a different quality, a weight she was deciding whether to put on the table. Your team was not the first unit to come into contact with Iron Veil in this area and survive. In 2 previous engagements over the last year, teams that made contact with them did not walk away. Your team walked away because of external assistance. Her eyes were careful and steady on his. I monitored your engagement. I saw the shooting from the east. Holt waited. I've been tracking an unknown actor in this range for 18 months, Voss said. Someone operating alone, using the terrain in ways that require extraordinary skill and local knowledge, engaging Iron Veil elements on at least 6 occasions and vanishing without leaving any trace that could establish identity. She stopped. Until tonight. Tonight I identified a shooting signature I recognized. The cold had settled deeper into the trees around them. Somewhere above, the wind drove a gust through the high branches and a cascade of snow fell in slow curtains between the firs. Holt watched her face. Whose signature, he asked. Voss looked at him for a moment with something that was not quite regret, but was in the same neighborhood. She said a name. He had already known. He had known since the 3 casings on the granite shelf. But hearing it spoken aloud by someone else in the present tense and not in the past tense of a casualty report landed differently than he had expected. It landed the way a stone lands in still water, with an initial impact and then expanding rings that kept moving outward into territory you hadn't accounted for. She's been here the whole time, Holt said. I believe so, Voss said. Or most of it. The earliest activity I can tentatively attribute to her dates to approximately 4 months after the incident that was reported as her death. What is she doing? Voss was quiet for a moment. The wind pushed through the trees again and she pulled her hood tighter. That, she said, is what I've been trying to determine for 18 months. And I believe the answer is in this range. I believe she has been building towards something. I believe she has been here, alone in these conditions, for a specific purpose that she has not yet completed. She looked at him steadily. Tonight changes things, she said. She let herself be seen. The signature, the pattern, the placement. That's not accident. She knows you're here. She chose to act in a way that would be recognized. He put his hand in his pocket and felt the spent casing there. The metal was still cold. She left a note, he said. What did it say? Don't follow. Voss absorbed this. She nodded slowly, not in agreement, but in the way people nod when a piece of information confirms something they had already suspected. She doesn't want interference. Whatever she's working toward, she doesn't want it disrupted. A beat, which means someone being here, your team, my operation, anything that introduces variables she can't control, is a risk she's been living with tonight. Holt thought about a woman lying on a granite shelf in a homemade ghillie suit in -20 Celsius, watching a firefight develop below her, making calculations, making the decision to intervene, making the decision afterward to be visible for exactly 3 seconds on a ridgeline 400 meters up, long enough to be certain, not long enough to be followed, making the decision to leave a knife she had carried for years. Not a warning. A signal, a specific signal directed at a specific person, which meant she had recognized him and had known that he would recognize what the signal meant. She knows I'm here, he said, specifically. Yes, Voss said. I think she's been watching this area long enough to know who moves through it. And I think she calculated that if she was going to intervene tonight, better to intervene in a way that communicated something to you, rather than simply a way that preserved deniability. He turned and looked back toward the shelter. Through the trees, he could see Callum moving, checking on Briggs, keeping the package calm with the steady competence that good NCOs learned and never lost. Farrow on the perimeter, doing his job, giving no sign that he was aware of anything unusual. Holt thought about 4 years. He thought about the paperwork he had signed. He thought about what a person had to be carrying. What weight of purpose. To spend 4 years in these mountains alone, in this cold, working towards something no one knew about. Declining every chance to surface, declining every chance to go back. Not hiding. That was what she had written in 2 words on a piece of paper attached to her own knife. Not a declaration of survival, a directive. Not look for me, not I'm here, not come find me. Don't follow, which was the statement of someone who was not hiding from anything, who knew exactly where she was and why she was there, who had made a choice years ago and was still living inside that choice, and who did not need to be found or rescued or brought back because she had never been lost. She was working. He understood that now, standing in the cold trees with a DIA officer who had spent 18 months trying to answer the same question he was only now beginning to ask. He understood it the way he understood terrain, not intellectually, not from a map, but from standing in it and letting it speak to him through his boots and his lungs and the back of his neck. She had a reason. She had been here long enough and through enough to know that the reason was worth what it cost. And she had decided tonight that whatever she was working toward was close enough to completion, that his presence was a variable she needed to communicate with rather than simply avoid. He pulled the spent casing out of his pocket. He looked at it for a moment. Then he looked up at the ridgeline to the east, long invisible now in the dark and the storm. He turned back to Voss. My team needs rest and warmth before we move again. We'll shelter here for 3 hours and then push for the handoff. He paused. I want you with us. That's why I'm here, Voss said. They walked back to the shelter. Callum looked up when Holt came in, looked at Voss, looked at Holt's face, and asked no questions. He was learning this one, learning what questions were useful and what questions were just noise. Briggs had his eyes closed. Farrow came in from the perimeter and settled without a word. The package had stopped staring at nothing and had started staring at something. The floor, his own hands, which was progress of a kind, the beginning of the particular recalibration that civilians had to do after they encountered, for the first time, what their world actually contained. Holt sat with his back against a tree trunk and his eyes half closed and let himself think. 3 hours. Then they would move. The storm would not cooperate, and neither would the terrain, And Iron Veil was still out there, reorganizing after the engagement. And someone in his chain of command had given them a route and a timeline, and that someone was either Pharaoh or Briggs or Callum or someone above Holt's pay grade entirely. And somewhere in the dark above them, in the snow and the wind, in the black Cascade night, a woman he had signed a death certificate for was moving through terrain she had made her home, working towards something she had spent 4 years preparing for, and had told him, in the clearest possible terms, to stay out of her way. He closed his hand around the spent casing. 3 hours. Then he would find out what she didn't want him to find. Holt did not sleep during those 3 hours. He did not try. He sat against his tree with his eyes open and his hands still, and let the dark work on him the way it always had, sorting things, filing things, bringing the important pieces to the surface, and letting the rest settle. He had learned to do this in places worse than this. Sleep was a luxury. Clarity was a tool. What he had at the end of those 3 hours was this. Teslin was alive. She had been in these mountains for approximately 4 years. She was engaged in some operation she had not disclosed to any authority he was aware of, which meant she was either rogue or running a mission so deep that the classification itself was the cover. Voss had tracked her for 18 months and still did not know the purpose. That meant Teslin had been careful. Not just field careful, the ordinary caution of a soldier in hostile territory, but architecturally careful. The kind of careful that required planning and discipline and a certainty of purpose strong enough to sustain it alone through 4 winters at altitude. He had also, by the end of those 3 hours, identified the second thing he knew. Pharaoh had given up the route and the timeline. He had not yet confirmed this. He had no proof. But 22 years of working with men in tight situations had given Holt a particular sensitivity to the quality of silence that a man produced when he was carrying something he was not saying. And Pharaoh's silence since the ambush had a texture to it that Holt did not like. He filed this and said nothing. Proof would come. It always did. At 0300, he roused the team with 2 words. They moved without complaint, which was one of the things that made them good. Briggs was stiff and pale, but upright and functional. The package moved when directed. Voss took the position behind Callum and in front of Pharaoh without being asked, which told Holt she had done this before, the physical language of patrol order being one of those things the body either knew or didn't. The storm had gentled in the early morning hours, not stopped, not finished, but paused in the way that mountain storms sometimes pause between movements, gathering themselves for the next act. The wind dropped to something manageable, visibility opened to 80 meters, then 100. The snow underfoot had crusted in the cold and it crunched under their boots with each step, which Holt disliked because sound carried in this kind of cold and this kind of quiet. But there was nothing to be done about it. The terrain was what the terrain was. They moved north and east, following a route that Holt had memorized from the pre-mission briefing and modified in his head based on what he now knew, which was that the original route had been compromised. He took them through a drainage he had not been briefed on, a narrow cut between 2 ridge lines that added distance to the journey, but had the advantage of not being on any map he had been given. If the original route was burned, the original maps might also be burned. He was operating on the assumption that everything passed down through the standard chain was potentially compromised, and he was constructing his decisions accordingly. They had been moving for 40 minutes when Teslin appeared. She did not emerge from the trees. She was simply not there. And then she was, standing 20 meters ahead on the trail, facing them, the M2010 slung across her back, and her hands visible at her sides, which was the closest thing to a white flag that a person like her could manage. She wore the same ghillie suit he had glimpsed on the ridgeline. At this distance, in this light, she looked like something the mountain had assembled from available materials and then decided to give a face to. The team stopped. Weapons came up instinctively. Holt raised a fist and said nothing. She looked at him across the 20 meters. Her face was thinner than he remembered. The bones of her jaw were more pronounced, the way faces got when they were being maintained rather than lived in, when the body had stripped everything unnecessary. Her eyes were the same, that particular quality of absolute attention that had made her the best he had ever served with. That way she had of looking at a situation the way a river looks at an obstacle, not with effort, but with patience, finding the line through it without apparent force. "You followed," she said. "You left a knife," Holt said. "That's not a brush-off. That's an invitation. She looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at each person in the group in turn, the way she always assessed, methodically, starting at the left and moving right, cataloging. Her eyes stopped on Voss for 2 seconds longer than the others. Not surprise. Recognition of some kind, complicated and not resolved. "How long have you been watching us tonight?" Holt asked. "Since before the ambush," she said. Callum made a small sound. Not fear, something more like the feeling a person has when a suspicion they had tried not to entertain is confirmed. "Then you could have warned us," Holt said. "I could have," she said. "I needed to see how Ironvale responded. I needed to see their protocol when a team came through this corridor. I've been waiting 6 weeks for a team to come through this corridor." She paused. "I didn't expect it to be your team." "Is that better or worse?" Holt asked. She thought about it with the same seriousness she applied to everything. "Different," she said finally. She looked at Voss again. This time she did not look away. "How long?" she asked. Voss understood the question. 18 months, she said, give or take. Teslin absorbed this. She looked back at Holt. "She's DIA." "I know," Holt said. "She's also why I'm still listed as KIA," Teslin said. Her voice did not change register. It was a statement of fact, delivered with the same neutrality she used for everything, which somehow made it heavier. "Ask her." Voss did not flinch. "That's accurate," she said. "I authorized the KIA classification." Briggs turned to look at Voss. Callum went very still. Farrow in the back said nothing, but Holt felt the quality of his silence shift in a way that he noted and set aside. "Then we need to talk," Holt said. "Yes," Teslin said, "but not here." She turned and moved into the trees at the right side of the trail, and after a moment Holt followed, and the team followed him, because that was how it worked, and had always worked, with men who trusted each other enough to walk into the dark behind a decision they did not yet fully understand. She led them for 6 minutes. Not far in distance, perhaps 400 meters, but the route she chose was specific. Through a stand of mature fir that muffled sound from all directions, across a frozen drainage using stones she clearly knew and had used before, up a short slope to a natural overhang of granite that created a sheltered space roughly the size of a small room. Inside the overhang, she had prepared a position, not a camp, nothing that suggested permanence or comfort, but a functional shelter, a thermal reflective panel across the rock face to keep the wind out, a small infrared heat element that produced warmth without visible light, a cache of equipment against the back wall that Holt's eye moved across and cataloged automatically. 2 rifles, a spotting scope, a radio unit he didn't recognize, ammunition, food stores, a medical kit larger than standard issue, notebooks, multiple rubber banded against moisture. She had been living here, or not here specifically, but in this kind of place, in this configuration, in these mountains. This was not a position she had built tonight. This was a way of living she had constructed and refined over a long time, until it was as automatic and considered as the way other people arrange their homes. She let them settle into the space. She gave Briggs the position closest to the heat element without being asked. She handed Callum a water bottle from the cache. She did these things without comment, the hospitality of a person who had been alone long enough that the gestures of it had become deliberate rather than automatic, things she had to remember to perform rather than things she simply did. Then she sat across from Holt, cross-legged on the rock, and she looked at Voss. "Tell him," Teslin said, "all of it." Voss was quiet for a moment. She looked at Holt. She had the expression of a person who has been carrying something for a long time and has finally arrived at the place where carrying it alone is no longer possible. "I authorized the KIA classification 4 years ago on the instruction of my then supervisor at DIA," she said. "His name was Marcus Reed. He told me the classification was necessary for operational security reasons related to a classified mission Teslin had been assigned to. He told me she was not dead, that she was operating under deep cover, and that the KIA listing was her cover story." She paused. "I believed him. I followed the order. I did not confirm the story through any independent channel because I was told that confirming it would compromise the operation." "And then," Holt said, "3 months later, I began looking at Reed's financial records as part of an unrelated internal audit. What I found suggested he was receiving payments from an external source that I could not identify through normal channels." She looked at her hands. It took me another 8 months to establish that Marcus Reed had been working for Warren Ashby for at least 2 years before he gave me the order to classify Teslin as KIA. The heat element hummed softly. Outside, the wind moved through the fir trees with the low, continuous sound of something breathing. So there was no classified mission, Holt said. No, Voss said. The helicopter incident was real. Teslin survived it, as you now know. But there was no deep cover operation waiting for her. Reed used the plausibility of classified work to get me to bury her record without asking questions. She looked at Teslin. When I understood what I had done, I began trying to find her. Why not go through official channels? Holt asked. Because by the time I understood what Reed was, I also understood that I did not know how deep the connection between Ashby and DIEA went. Reed was one person. He might have been the only one, or he might not have been. She stopped. I was not willing to surface Teslin's existence through a channel that might be monitored by people who wanted her dead. Teslin had been watching Voss through this entire account with the expression of someone listening to a version of a story they already know, checking it for accuracy. She did not interrupt. When Voss finished, Teslin looked at Holt. She's telling the truth, Teslin said, or the version of the truth she has access to. There are pieces she still doesn't know. Tell me the pieces, Holt said. Teslin unfolded her legs and stood. She went to the cache against the back wall and retrieved one of the rubber-banded notebooks. She set it on the rock between them. Don't open it yet, she said. She sat back down. In the months before the helicopter incident, I was assigned as sniper support for a series of operations in this mountain range. Classified operations. The stated purpose was monitoring of domestic extremist activity, which is unusual for someone with my training, but not impossible. What I actually observed across 6 operations over approximately 4 months was not extremist activity. She paused. It was logistics. Ironvale was moving material through this range, large quantities of weapons-grade material, moving it from the Cold War bunker system in these mountains into a distribution network that I could not fully map from my overwatch positions, but that clearly extended well beyond this range. She looked at Holt. Not extremists, she said. Not a private militia with ambitions above its weight class. A supply operation. Someone was using these bunkers as a warehouse for weapons that are not supposed to exist outside of controlled federal inventory, and Warren Ashby was running the logistics. The overhang was very quiet. Briggs had opened his eyes. Callum was looking at the notebook. Even the package, who had been sitting in a corner with the expression of a man trying very hard not to exist, had raised his eyes. When I reported what I was seeing through my chain of command, Teslin said, the operation stopped immediately. My access was restricted, and 3 weeks later I was on a helicopter that went down with a rocket-propelled grenade through the tail rotor. She said this the same way she said everything, without emphasis, without the theatrical pause that a different person might have used. Someone in my chain of command passed what I reported to Ashby. He tried to kill me. I survived. She touched the notebook, and I came back. To finish what you started, Holt said. To build a case that cannot be dismissed, she said. What I reported 4 years ago was observations from a sniper overwatch position. It was my word. It could be attributed to misidentification, to a soldier seeing what she expected to see rather than what was there. What is in that notebook is 14 months of documentation. Photographs, coordinates, inventory estimates based on observed movement patterns, chain of command analysis, communication intercepts. She paused. Enough that dismissing it requires an active decision to dismiss it, which itself creates a record. Holt looked at the notebook. He thought about what it meant to spend 14 months building something like that, alone, in winter, in mountains that killed people who were less prepared than Teslin. Building it with the same patience and precision she brought to everything, shot by shot, entry by entry, in the certainty that the evidence had to be not just sufficient but overwhelming, had to be the kind of thing that survived the attempt to discredit it. He understood something then that he had not understood before. She had not chosen to stay. She had chosen to finish. Those were not the same thing, and the distinction mattered. There's a handoff point, he said, 40 kilometers from the insertion point. A federal contact waiting. The package's knowledge of the bunker infrastructure is what Ironvale has been trying to acquire. What we know now is that his knowledge could also be used to corroborate your documentation. Teslin had already seen this. He could tell from the way her attention did not sharpen, the way a person's attention does when a new piece of information arrives. She had already placed the package in the architecture of what she was building. Yes, she said, which is why Ashby will try again before we reach that point. How many does he have in this range? Holt asked. In the immediate area after tonight, approximately 15, she said. His best people. The ambush you walked into was his A-team. The fact that they failed will have already told him that something changed. He'll be recalibrating. His best shooter, Holt said, the one called Quarry. For the first time, something crossed her face that was not neutrality, not fear, not anger, something more specific than either. Pruitt, she said. Dex Pruitt. We trained together at Bragg. He washed out of the sniper certification program on ethics grounds and went private 2 years ago. She was quiet for a moment. He's very good. Better than you? She considered the question with the same seriousness she had applied to the question of whether Holt's presence was better or worse than a stranger's. Different, she said again. He's aggressive. He takes shots I wouldn't take because I'm thinking about what comes after the shot. He's not thinking about after, just the shot. That's a liability, Holt said. In a fair situation, she said, Ashby isn't going to give us a fair situation. Farrow shifted his position at the edge of the overhang. It was a small movement, barely perceptible, but Holt caught it. The quality of restlessness was different from the ordinary discomfort of cold stone. It was directional. It was the movement of a person calculating. Holt made his decision quietly without showing it on his face. He continued looking at Teslin. You need to show me the route to the handoff point that avoids the compromised corridor, he said. There isn't one that avoids Iron Vale entirely, she said. The range is their operational area. The best I can do is a route they're less likely to have pre-positioned on. She paused. Through the bunker system. Callum looked up. The access shaft is 2 kilometers southeast, Teslin said. It goes under 3 ridgelines. It comes out 4 kilometers from the handoff point. In the open sections, the bunkers are warmer than the surface, which matters for Briggs, and Iron Vale has not used the northern section for 3 months, which suggests they believe the access is sealed. She almost, not quite, smiled. I unsealed it 14 months ago. You've been using their warehouse as a corridor, Holt said. Among other things, she said, yes. Outside, the wind had picked up again. The second movement of the storm was arriving, right on schedule, the way mountain storms always arrived on schedule if you knew how to read them. Holt stood. He looked at his team. Briggs, pale and careful. Callum, alert and processing. The package, resigned and useful. Voss, something complicated still working itself out behind her eyes. Farrow watching Teslin. We move in 10 minutes, Holt said. Callum, give Briggs the secondary pack load. Voss, you stay between Callum and me, he paused. Farrow, rear security. Farrow nodded. Nothing in his face gave anything away. He was good at that. But good was not the same as perfect. And Holt had been reading men for 22 years. And what he had read in Farrow's face in the half-second before the nod was the particular blankness that men adopted when they were concealing not just an expression, but a decision. He filed it. He said nothing. He turned back to Teslin. She was already ready to move, the way she was always ready, all the unnecessary things already stripped away. She looked at him with the attention she had always given him, the specific attention she gave to problems she was in the process of solving. The knife, she said. Did you bring it? He looked at Callum, who produced the KA bar from inside his jacket. Teslin took it back without ceremony, reversed it, and settled it into the sheath on her left leg, where it had lived for years before she died and continued to live afterward. Let's go, she said. The access shaft was not on any map Holt had been given, which confirmed what he had suspected about his maps. It was disguised as a collapsed maintenance structure, a concrete cap half buried in snow, and if you did not know what you were looking for, you would walk past it without a second thought. Teslin removed the cap in 3 practice movements that spoke of repetition. Below it, a metal ladder descended into darkness. She went first. Holt sent Callum in the package next, then Voss, then Briggs. He looked at Farrow. After you, Holt said. Farrow went down the ladder. Holt replaced the cap over their heads and descended into the cold dark. The bunker was not what Holt had imagined. He had imagined Cold War aesthetic. Damp concrete, rusted infrastructure, the bones of a system that had been waiting underground since the 1960s for a war that never came. The bones were there. All of that, the vaulted ceilings and the heavy blast doors and the electrical conduit running along the walls in its aged casing. But layered over the bones was something current: wooden pallets, heavy plastic storage cases in military green, equipment that had been moved recently enough that the disturbed dust had not yet resettled. Teslin swept her light across it. She was reading the space the way she read terrain, looking for what had changed since she had last been here. Something had changed. She stopped. She held her light on a section of the northwest wall where pallet positions had been marked on the floor in chalk. 3 weeks ago, according to her notation, those positions had held sealed cases. Now they held nothing. The case were gone. They moved the material, she said quietly. When? Holt asked. Within the last week, she said, maybe less. She was running the calculation. He could see it happening behind her eyes, the same way he ran calculations, the variables aligning and realigning until a shape emerged. Ashby isn't waiting to be investigated, she said. He's moving to the next phase. Whatever he's been storing here, he's deploying it. The temperature in the bunker was -8, which was warmer than the surface, but still cold enough that the breath of 6 people produced visible clouds in the beam of the light. Holt watched Teslin stand in the center of the empty pallet space and understand something that shifted the entire architecture of what she had spent 14 months building. She turned to her boss, the federal contact at the handoff point. How quickly can they authorize action on documentation I provide? Voss was careful. Depending on what the documentation shows and who has authorization to review it, emergency protocols can move in hours. Hours, Teslin said. It was not a question. It was the sound of a person calculating whether hours was enough. What was in those cases? Holt asked. She looked at him. For a moment she seemed to weigh what to say, the way she had always weighed things, the same fundamental discipline applied to words that she applied to shots. No wasted expenditure. Every round counted. Anti-armor weapons systems, she said. Enough to outfit a company-sized element. Enough to destroy hardened infrastructure. Enough to, depending on how they're positioned, close a highway or bring down a bridge or deny access to a mountain pass. She paused. There are 4 critical access points to this range. Roads, not trails. Roads that emergency and federal vehicles would use if they were responding to something happening in this area. Callum got there first. He was young and quick and had spent the last several hours recalibrating fast. He's going to seal the range, Callum said. Cut off the access routes. Then he can do whatever he's doing up here without interference for long enough to finish it. Teslin looked at Callum for a moment. Yes, she said. Holt stood very still. He needs a window, Holt said. A window of time when no federal eyes can get into this range. Yes, Teslin said. And he's creating that window now. The bunker was quiet around them. The moved pallets cast angular shadows in the beam of the light. Somewhere deeper in the facility, something mechanical hummed at low frequency, the ghost of a system that had been running since before any of them were born. Then Holt heard it, the smallest of sounds. Metal on metal, almost nothing, the kind of sound that only registered if you had been trained for 22 years to register exactly that. He turned. Farrow was not at rear security. Farrow was at the junction of the main corridor in the eastern branch, 11 meters away, and in his left hand was a compact transmitter. Military specification, and the indicator light on its face was green, which meant it had already transmitted, which meant that whatever signal it sent had already left this bunker and was already traveling through whatever relay system Farrow had set up to whoever was waiting for it. Everything happened at once. Holt moved. Callum moved. Farrow, seeing both of them move, made the calculation that the transmitter had already done its work, and he did not run and he did not fight. He simply stopped. He stood in the junction with his hand at his side and the transmitter dangling and waited for what came next, with the expression of a man who has been carrying something for a long time and has finally been relieved of it. Holt reached him in 4 strides. He took the transmitter, he looked at it. The battery indicator showed it had drawn full power in a single burst, which meant a single compressed transmission, which meant coordinates and status, which meant Iron Veil now knew exactly where they were and which direction they were moving. He looked at Farrow. How long have you been with them? Holt asked. Farrow met his eyes. 7 months, he said. Briggs? Clean, Farrow said. Just me. Holt handed the transmitter to Callum. He looked at Farrow for a moment longer, reading him, the way he always read men, looking for what was true underneath what was presented. What was true in Pharaoh's face was not defiance and not pride. It was something closer to relief, and that was the saddest version of this particular situation. The version where the man had been carrying it long enough that being caught was the best thing that had happened to him in months. How many at the north exit? Holt asked. Pharaoh hesitated. Then, Quarry has been deployed since yesterday. He's been positioned at the north exit for 3 hours. Ashby pre-positioned him based on intelligence I passed 2 days ago about the bunker access route. Teslin heard this from where she was standing. Her face did not change. She absorbed the information the way she absorbed all tactical information, assigning it its proper weight in the structure of what came next. She looked at Holt. There's a second exit, she said. Ashby doesn't know about it. Pharaoh doesn't know about it. She glanced at Pharaoh. Because I found it 8 months ago and I didn't put it in any document that could be intercepted. Pharaoh stared at her. Teslin looked back at Holt. The second exit comes out on the western face, 2 kilometers from the handoff point. Open ground, ridge above it, sightline in all directions. She paused. Quarry is at the north exit, but when Pharaoh's signal reaches Ashby, Ashby will redirect Quarry to the west face. He knows this terrain. He'll anticipate the alternate route. How long before Quarry can reposition? Holt asked. 30 minutes, Teslin said. Maybe less if he moves fast. Then we have a window. A small one, she said. We go west, we move fast, and I deal with Quarry if he gets there before we clear the open ground. She said it the way she said everything, without drama, without the performance of determination. She said it as a plan, which it was. And Ashby? Holt said. Ashby is moving to the access roads with the anti-armor system, she said. We have less time than we thought, which means we move now. She turned toward the western section of the bunker and began to walk, not waiting to see if anyone would follow because she had never needed to wait for that. The team moved, even Pharaoh moved, because Callum had secured his hands with a chem light strap and was guiding him, and because the alternative to moving was staying in a Cold War bunker alone in the dark in the Cascade Mountains in January, which was not a choice that a rational person made. Holt took rear security. He walked through the bunker with the empty pallet spaces and the ancient concrete and the ghost of a system built for a war that never happened. And he thought about what it meant that a woman who should have been dead for 4 years had found a corridor that Ashby's people didn't know about and had kept it to herself for 8 months, exactly because she knew that someday she would need something that nobody had poisoned. She was always thinking about after the shot. That was the difference. The western corridor was narrower than the main passage. Teslin moved through it with the ease of familiarity, not using her light now, navigating by memory and touch, her hand trailing the left wall in the specific pattern of someone who has done this in complete darkness enough times that the path lived in her body rather than her mind. Holt followed her in the dark and thought about what kind of person spent 8 months preparing for a contingency that had not yet presented itself. And he understood that he was thinking about the kind of person he had always known she was. The kind he had never fully had words for until now. The kind who did not survive by luck. The kind who survived by deciding a long time ago that every variable she could control, she would control, and then spending the necessary time and patience controlling it. The exit was a hatch in the floor of a narrow room at the end of the corridor. She opened it from memory, found the ladder by touch, descended, and opened the outer seal from below. Cold air hit them like a wall. They came out on the western face of the range into a world of gray pre-dawn light and open ground and wind that had come back to full strength. The slope ran 300 meters of exposed terrain before it broke into the tree line below. Above, to the north and east, the ridgeline was a dark serrated line against a sky that had not yet decided to become morning. Teslin stood at the exit hatch and looked at the ridgeline for 12 seconds. Still. Completely still. Not deciding, computing, reading elevation, approach angles, the fall lines of the slope, the likely positions a shooter of Quarry's training and habits would occupy given 20 minutes of repositioning time. Then she looked at Holt. Get them moving, she said. Northwest, fast. Don't stop regardless of what you hear. And you, he said. I have work to do, she said. She unslung the M2010 and checked the optic with 3 practice movements. She pulled a small notebook from her chest pocket, tore out a single page with coordinates written on it, and pressed it into Holt's hand. If I'm not at the handoff point in 40 minutes, she said, give that to the federal contact. He'll know what to do with it. She did not wait for his answer. She began moving east along the base of the ridge, low and fast, her white ghillie suit absorbing her into the gray of the pre-dawn slope until within 30 seconds, she was invisible. Not gradually disappearing, but simply no longer there, the way light left a room when the switch was thrown. Holt pocketed the paper. "Northwest," he said to the team. "Fast, don't stop for anything." They moved onto the open slope. Teslin moved east for 200 meters before she went vertical, climbing the ridge face using the rock outcroppings and the frozen root systems of trees that clung to the upper slope, moving silently, distributing her weight the way she had learned to distribute it across terrain that would announce her if she let it. The ghillie suit caught the wind, and she pressed close to the rock face and waited for the gust to pass and then continued climbing. Her hands were very cold. She did not think about her hands. She was thinking about Pruitt. She had trained alongside him for 11 months at Fort Bragg before his ethics review ended his certification candidacy. She knew his patterns the way you knew the patterns of someone you had practiced against. The tendency to go high when the terrain gave him the option, the preference for positions with 2 exit routes, the habit of establishing a range card by firing 1 orientation shot into open ground before settling into a target sequence. That orientation shot was a tell. She had identified it as a tell during their shared training, and she had never told him. You didn't tell a man his tells when you might someday be on opposite sides of a ridgeline. She reached the upper ridge and came over it low, on her stomach, in one smooth motion that brought her eyes above the rock line without lifting her silhouette above it. The ridgeline ran northeast for 400 meters before it broke into a secondary summit. She quartered it systematically, the way she quartered every piece of terrain, near to far, left to right, looking for what didn't belong, for the shape that was wrong, for the stillness that was too deliberate. She found him at 260 meters, northeast, tucked into a natural depression in the rock with a snow berm in front of him that he had shaped. She could see the shaping. It was recent. The snow had not yet crusted at the edges. He had a Barrett MR8 in .338 Lapua, which was a good choice for open groundwork at extended range. He was looking northwest through his scope at the group moving across the open slope below. He had found them. He was calculating his first shot. Teslin had approximately 8 seconds before he settled on a firing solution. She did not rush. Rushing was how people missed. She established position, controlled her breathing to a 4-count pattern, and acquired him through the M2010 scope. At 260 meters in this wind, the shot was not technically difficult. The difficulty was in the requirement. She needed to disable him without killing him, which meant a precision target at a moving part of a prone shooter who was not going to remain still once he understood he was being engaged. She watched him. He shifted his weight to his right elbow. That shift was the precursor to the final breath hold before a shot. She had seen him do it 100 times in training. He was about to fire. She exhaled to the natural empty of her lungs. Held. Put the crosshairs on his right forearm where it rested on the bipod, made a half-inch adjustment for the wind that had gusted once in the last 30 seconds, and pressed the trigger through with the same smooth patience she brought to everything. The shot broke. She was already watching through the scope for effect. Pruitt's right arm collapsed inward, and he rolled involuntarily onto his left side, the rifle dropping free of the bipod. He did not make a sound she could hear from this distance. He pressed his right hand against his chest and rolled onto his back and lay still, looking at the sky above him, which was what a person did when a round had passed through the forearm and the central nervous system was busy processing what had just happened to it. He was alive. His arm was destroyed for any work that required a trigger. He would need a hospital within 6 hours. She put the second shot through his rifle scope housing at the moment he reached for the weapon with his left hand. The scope disintegrated. The rifle went inert. He did not reach for it again. She held her position for 30 seconds, watching. He did not move except to breathe. Below and to the northwest, the group was still moving, still intact. The 5 figures making progress across the open slope toward the tree line. Callum had closed the formation tight. They were moving well. Holt had not looked back. Good. She did not leave 3 casings this time. She was not finished yet. She came off the ridge the way she had come up, controlled and quiet, and began moving northwest at a pace that would bring her to the handoff point inside the 40-minute window she had named. The sky above the eastern peaks was beginning to show the first pale suggestion of color, the precursor to dawn that the mountains always announced before the valleys knew it was coming. Behind her, in the depression where he had made his range card and his snow berm and his careful preparations, Dex Pruitt lay on his back with his right arm folded against his chest and looked at a sky that was becoming slowly, indifferently lighter, and understood with the particular clarity that came from lying on a ridge line alone and wounded in January that the woman who had trained beside him for 11 months had known all along how to find him. He had never learned how to find her. Holt heard one shot. Then 90 seconds later, a second shot. He did not break stride. He had been listening to the ridge above with the attention of a man who had learned to read gunfire the way other men read weather. And what he heard in those two shots was not a duel. What he heard was a procedure. Methodical, deliberate, two distinct purposes separated by time enough to confirm the first had achieved its result before the second was required. He kept moving. They reached the tree line and pushed through it, and the wind dropped immediately behind the wall of fir, and the walking became easier. And Briggs, who had been grinding through the open slope on something below what Holt would have called reserves, seemed to find something additional when the terrain relented. Callum stayed at his shoulder. Neither of them spoke. There was nothing to say that the walking wasn't saying better. They were inside the tree line for 12 minutes when Teslin came in from the southeast, moving fast and low, and fell into pace beside Holt without announcement, the way she had always moved, as if the space beside him had simply decided to be occupied. He looked at her. She was breathing harder than usual. Working. Quarry, he said quietly. Done, she said. Killed? She was quiet for a moment. Forearm and rifle, she said. He'll need a hospital. He won't finish this op. He understood what she was telling him. She had done what she had always done, what he had seen her do across 2 deployments, and what she had apparently continued doing alone in these mountains for 4 years. She had used exactly the force the situation required and not 1 grain more. Not because she was incapable of more, because she had decided at some point in her career or her character that the measure of a shooter was not what they were willing to do, but what they were capable of choosing not to do. Ashby, he said. Moving, she said. He had 3 vehicles at the south access road when I came off the ridge. He's repositioning his anti-armor teams. He still thinks he has a window. She glanced at Voss. How quickly can your contact move after we hand over the documentation? He has a direct line into a regional FBI task force that has been waiting for actionable intelligence on domestic weapons trafficking for 14 months, Voss said. He can have a response moving in under 2 hours. Then we need to reach the handoff point, Teslin said, before Ashby understands that his window has already been closed from the inside. The trees around them were dense and dark, and the wind moved through the high canopy in long passes that sounded like breath. They moved in the sound of it, 6 people reduced to 5, making their way through terrain that Teslin knew, and the rest of them were navigating on trust, toward a lookout station that was waiting on a ridge 4 kilometers ahead with a federal contact and a vehicle in the beginning of the end of a 4-year operation that no one had authorized and no one had known to ask for. Behind them, on the western face of the Cascade Range, the gray sky was beginning to show its first true color at the peaks. The storm had spent itself in the night. What remained was the cold, which was permanent, and the mountains, which were older than any of this, and the particular silence that settled into a range after a fight was over and before anyone had come to account for what the fight had cost. It was the silence of things having been decided. It was, in its way, a kind of peace. The handoff point was a decommissioned fire lookout station on a secondary ridge, a square wooden structure on legs that had stood since the 1940s, watching for smoke in the trees below. It had stopped watching when the Forest Service automated the process and left the structure to age in the weather. It was still structurally sound, which Holt knew from the mission briefing, and it had a clear line of sight in all directions, which he now understood was the actual reason the federal contact had chosen it. You did not pick a position like that for convenience. You picked it because you could see everything coming. They climbed the last 400 meters of slope without incident. Every step felt like the mountain testing something one final time. One more condition placed between where they had been and where they needed to be. Briggs made it. He made it on his own feet, Callum matching him step for step. And when they reached the ridge, he stood for a moment with his hand on his knee and his breath coming in long, controlled pulls. And then he straightened up. Nobody commented on this. It did not require comment. The federal contact was a man in his mid-50s named only by his credential and his handshake, which was firm and brief. He had the careful, document-shaped quality of a person who operated in rooms rather than terrain, who understood threat in fundamentally different terms than the people now standing in front of him. He looked at the group with the assessment of a man counting variables. He looked at Pharaoh's secured hands. He looked at Teslin for a long moment, taking in the ghillie suit and the rifle and the particular quality of stillness she carried. And then he looked at Holt. "I was expecting a smaller delivery," the man said. "The situation developed," Holt said. The man looked at Teslin again. "You're the one they call Wraith." Teslin did not answer. She reached inside her jacket and produced the notebook and held it out. The man took it with both hands. He looked at the cover, the rubber band, the worn edges of the binding, all the evidence of how far it had traveled to reach him. He did not open it immediately. He looked at her. "This is everything," he said. "That's the backup," Teslin said. "The primary is already on a server your task force can access. I uploaded it through a secure relay 3 weeks ago. I've been waiting for a physical handoff to establish chain of custody." She paused. "What's in your hand is corroboration. What's on that server is the case." The man absorbed this. He looked at her with the expression of a person who has prepared for one version of a conversation and is now having a different and significantly more consequential one. "You've had the primary documentation uploaded for 3 weeks, he said. "Yes," she said. "Then why the physical handoff? Why wait?" "Because a server can be disputed," she said. "A chain of custody that involves a federal handoff in front of witnesses cannot." She looked at him steadily. "I've been waiting for the right witnesses." The man opened the notebook. He looked at the first page, then the second, then at a coordinate grid on the third that was dense with notation. He was quiet for a moment that had a different quality than the other moments. The quality of a person reading something that confirms what they have spent a long time suspecting. He looked up. "Ashby is mobile," Holt said. "He has anti-armor systems that were moved from the bunker system within the last week. He's positioning to seal the access roads into this range. Your task force needs to move simultaneously on the access points and the northern bunkers, or he creates his window." The man had already produced his phone. He turned partly away and began making calls in the rapid, compressed language of a person executing a plan that has been waiting for the right trigger. His voice was low and specific, the voice of someone who had prepared for exactly this moment and was now running the prepared sequence. Voss moved alongside him. She began talking, her own voice steady and factual. The intelligence officer's debrief delivered at speed. Everything she knew about Reed and Ashby and the chain of corruption inside DIA, laid out in the organized sequence of a person who had been rehearsing this report in her head for 18 months. Holt watched the two of them work the phones and thought that this was what 4 years of patience looked like when it finally landed. Not dramatic, not triumphant. Just two people on telephones making calls that would take hours to become visible as consequences, but that were already in the machinery of federal authority becoming irreversible. He turned to his team. Callum had Briggs sitting on the lookout station's steps, working on the shoulder wound properly now that they were stationary. Briggs had his head back and his eyes closed and was letting it happen, which was its own kind of trust. The package stood at the edge of the ridge, looking down at the valley below where the roads ran between the trees like threads, looking at familiar terrain from an elevation that changed what it meant. Pharaoh sat on a rock with his hands secured and looked at the ground between his feet, with the particular stillness that came when a person had set down something heavy and did not yet know how to hold their body without it. Holt walked to him. He stood in front of him for a moment. Pharaoh did not look up. 7 months, Holt said, not accusatory, just placing the number in the air between them. Pharaoh looked up then. His face had changed since the bunker. Something that had been held rigid in it had released. He looked older. He looked, in some way Holt did not have a word for, more honest. "They approached me after my 3rd tour," Pharaoh said. "I was in a bad place. The things I'd seen were sitting on me in ways I hadn't expected." He stopped. "I told myself it was just information. Routing data, nothing that would put anyone in the ground." Holt said nothing. "I knew it was a lie when I told it," Pharaoh said. Holt looked at him for a long moment. He thought about what it cost a man to carry something like that for 7 months, through deployments, through operations, through the daily proximity of men who trusted him. He thought about the relief he had seen in Pharaoh's face in the bunker. He thought about the fact that when given the chance to run, Pharaoh had not run. He had transmitted. He had done the last thing his obligation to Iron Veil required, and then he had stopped completely and waited for what came next. He did not absolve Pharaoh. He did not condemn him. He said, "You'll tell them everything. Every contact, every piece of information you gave them, every name." "Yes," Pharaoh said. "All of it," Holt said. "All of it," Pharaoh said. Holt turned to find Teslin standing at the far end of the ridge, away from the coals and the logistics and the machinery of consequence that was now running without her. She had her back to the group. She was looking out at the mountains, the ridgelines going back and back in the strengthening morning light, layers of terrain receding into distance, not looking at it the way a person looked at a view, the way a person looked at a place they had lived, cataloging it, the way you looked at a room you were leaving for the last time. He walked to her. He stood beside her and looked at what she was looking at. The range was enormous from here. The distances between the peaks made him understand, in a physical way that maps could not convey, what it meant to live alone in this for 4 years. The scale of the silence, the scale of the cold, the scale of the commitment required to persist in it for a purpose that kept not being finished, that kept requiring one more season. One more interval of patience that no one was asking for because no one knew to ask. "How much of it did you know when you came back?" he said. 4 years ago. "How much did you have?" "Almost nothing," she said. "I had what I'd observed in 6 operations. I had the certainty that Ashby had tried to kill me. I had nowhere to go that felt safe." She paused. "I had this range. I knew it better than anyone who was looking for me. So I went back into it. And the 14 months of documentation came later," she said. "The first year was survival. Learning the range at the level of living in it rather than passing through it. Finding the access points Iron Veil used. Understanding their patterns." She paused again. "The second year I started building the case. I understood by then that I could not simply surface and report what I knew. What I knew without documentation was a story a soldier told. What I needed was something that could not be dismissed." He looked at the side of her face. The morning light was coming in at a low angle from the east, and it caught the lines of exhaustion that the dark had not shown him, the specific toll of years, not just of hardship, but of sustained purpose, without the ordinary human reinforcements of recognition or companionship. She had done this without any of those things, not because she was constructed differently than other people, but because she had decided that the thing she was doing was worth the commitment, and she had held that decision across 4 winters and never renegotiated it. "Were there times when you could have walked out?" he asked. She was quiet for a moment. "Yes," she said, "several times." "What stopped you?" She turned and looked at him. "The same thing that made me good at the work," she said. "Once I'm on a shot, I'm on it. You don't move off a shot because it gets uncomfortable. A beat. You move off when it's finished." He held her gaze. There was no performance in it, just the statement of a person who had made a decision and lived inside it until it was complete. "It's finished now," he said. She looked back at the mountains. "Almost," she said. Then Callum was at Holt's shoulder, and his voice had a different quality, tightened. "Sergeant, movement on the south track." Holt turned. 3 vehicles coming up the south track, moving fast, the kind of fast that did not belong to federal responders who had just received a call. These vehicles had been moving before any call was made. They had been moving toward this position while Teslin was still on the ridge with Pruitt, which meant Ashby had known about the lookout station before tonight. He had known it was the handoff point. Someone had given him this too, or he had worked it out from the operational pattern, or he had eyes on the range he had not deployed yet. He had not run. He had maneuvered. Holt assessed. The track below was the only vehicle access to the ridge. The vehicles would reach the base in approximately 4 minutes. The ridge itself was defensible, clear sight lines, good cover in the lookout station structure and the rock outcroppings. But defensible meant pinned if the vehicles brought more personnel than they could handle. Teslin had already done the same assessment. She was back at the M2010, checking the optic, her movements precise and unhurried. She looked at the track, then at the vehicles, then at the ridgeline above the track where the approach was channeled by 2 granite faces into a single negotiable line. 4 minutes, Holt said. 3, she said. The lead vehicle is pushing. Driver knows this track. The federal contact finished his call, and looked at the vehicles on the track below and went very still in the way that civilians went still when the abstract category of danger became a specific vehicle moving toward them at speed. He looked at Holt. "The task force is 40 minutes out," he said. "Then we hold the ridge for 40 minutes, Holt said. He looked at Teslin. "How many per vehicle?" "Assuming standard load," she said, 4 to 6 each. Call it 15 total, maybe 18. "Same numbers as the range," Callum said. "Ashby brought everyone," Teslin said. She was looking at the lead vehicle. "He's in the first vehicle. I can see the antenna configuration on the roof. That's a command vehicle." Holt looked at her. "You're sure?" "He uses a specific redundant communication setup," she said. "I've been watching it for 14 months. 2 antennas, offset. That's his vehicle." Holt made the calculation fast. They had the high ground. They had Teslin. They had Callum, who was good at close work, and Voss, who had been in enough of these situations to know how to make herself useful. They had Briggs, who was wounded but had not lost his hands. They had the federal contact in the package, who were not fighters but were not panicking. 15 minutes. Teslin could shape the approach and buy time. If Ashby wanted to reach the ridge, he would have to come up that track, and that track was visible from the lookout station for its entire length, which was why the federal contact had chosen this point, and why Teslin needed to be in a position along it before the vehicles reached the base. "I need the high ground on the east face," Teslin said. "Give me 90 seconds. "Go," Holt said. She went, low and fast, the way she always moved when time was the critical variable, using the rock outcroppings on the east face as cover, and within 60 seconds she was positioned. Prone, the M2010 pointed down the slope at the approach track, the early morning light giving her the angle she needed. Holt put Callum at the north corner of the lookout station with a sight line to the base of the track. He positioned Voss and the federal contact inside the structure with the package. He settled Briggs at the south corner, sitting against the station wall, one hand on his rifle. "You see it, you call it," Holt told him. Briggs nodded once. Holt took the center. He stood between the two corners and watched the track. The vehicles came up fast. The lead vehicle, a heavy-duty pickup modified with a brush guard and roof rack, reached the flat at the base of the ridge and stopped. The 2 vehicles behind it stopped in sequence. The doors did not open immediately. Someone in the lead vehicle was looking at the ridge through binoculars. Ashby, taking his own assessment. He would see the lookout station. He would see the government SUV parked at the base of the stairs. He would count the vehicles in the tracks in the snow and understand that the handoff had already happened, that the documentation was already in federal hands, that whatever he had come here to prevent had not been prevented. The doors of the lad vehicle opened. Ashby stepped out. He was a large man, the size of someone who had been strong most of his life and had aged into a different kind of solidity, broader and slower, but still formidable. He wore cold weather gear with no insignia. He stood at the door of his vehicle and looked up the slope at the lookout station with the particular stillness of a man who has made his calculations and reached a conclusion he does not like. He made no signal to the men behind him. No one else exited the vehicles. He walked to the base of the track and began climbing alone. Holt watched him come. He understood what this was. Ashby was not coming to fight. He was coming because a man who had spent 30 years in special forces and 2 decades building something in the dark understood that there were moments when coming alone was the only option that preserved anything. Not dignity exactly, something older than dignity, the willingness to face what you had made. Holt walked to the top of the track and waited. Ashby came up the slope steadily, the way a man climbed a hill when he was not trying to impress anyone with his pace, just covering ground, and stopped 6 feet from Holt at the top of the ridge. He looked at Holt. He looked past Holt, at the lookout station, at the federal contact's vehicle, at the east face of the ridge, where a woman in a white ghillie suit was visible only because she allowed herself to be. He looked at Teslin for a long moment. "I should have confirmed," he said, not to Holt, to the space where the mistake lived. Holt said nothing. Ashby looked at him. He was not afraid. Holt gave him credit for that. He was a man who had reached the end of something he had spent a long time building, and he was looking at that end with the directness of someone who had spent enough of their life in places where flinching was not a viable option. 31 years, Ashby said. "That's how long I served. You want to know why?" "No," Holt said. Ashby looked at him. He had expected something else. Anger or speech, or the satisfaction of explaining himself to someone who would understand the scale of what he had built. What he got was a single syllable from a man who had been awake for 18 hours in the cold and had no interest in the reasons. "You have people in those vehicles," Holt said. "Send them down the mountain now." Ashby held Holt's gaze for a moment longer. Then he turned and made a single hand signal down the slope. Below, the vehicle doors opened and men stepped out and stood in the cold, looking up. And then the doors opened again and they got back in, and one by one the three vehicles reversed down the track and disappeared from the flat. Ashby turned back to Holt. "The documentation she built," he said, "is it complete?" "Yes," Holt said. Ashby nodded slowly. Not acceptance exactly. The nod of a man confirming a number he already knew. "Then you don't need anything else from me." "No," Holt said, "I don't." Ashby put his hands behind his back. It was a military gesture, the posture of attention, and it landed strangely and exactly right on the top of a ridge in the Cascade Range in January. The posture of a man standing in an accounting that was larger than any room it could be conducted in. Callum came from the north corner and stood behind Ashby without being asked. He was 29 years old and learning, and what he had understood without being told was that the right thing to do right now was to be present, to be a witness, to stand in the particular silence that a moment like this required. They waited. The task force vehicles arrived in 38 minutes. They came up the south track in a convoy of 4 federal plates, moving with the purposeful, organized speed of an operation that has been waiting for authorization and has finally received it. They parked at the base of the ridge, and people with federal identification came up the slope in the morning, which had been getting steadily lighter since before dawn, was now fully present. The sun still below the eastern peaks, but the sky above them, the bright, cold blue that followed a storm. Holt stood at the edge of the ridge and watched it happen. He watched Ashby be taken into federal custody with the professional quiet of an arrest conducted by people who understood the weight of who they were arresting. He watched the federal contact hand over the notebook and begin a conversation on a satellite phone that would not end for several days. He watched Voss give a second debrief, this one to a woman in a federal jacket who wrote things down in a notebook of her own. He watched Teslin come off the east face and walk back across the ridge to the lookout station. The M2010 slung, the ghillie suit still on, and stand at the edge of the group for a moment before a federal agent approached her with credentials and the look of a person who had been briefed but had not quite been prepared for the reality. She did not look at Holt. She did not need to. He understood. This was the part that belonged to the people with the notebooks and the jurisdiction and the authority to process what 4 years of work in a mountain range had produced. His part was done. It had ended when Ashby came up the slope alone and stood in the accounting. Callum appeared at Holt's shoulder. He had the timing for these moments now. The instinct for when presence was the right thing and distance was wrong. "Briggs," Holt said. "Medics have him," Callum said. "He's going to be fine. Surgery, 3 months. Back in service." He paused. "Pharaoh's in processing." "One way or another," Holt said. They stood in silence for a moment. Below, in the valley, the access roads that Ashby had meant to seal were being secured from the other direction. Federal vehicles moving through the dawn toward the positions where Iron Barrel had deployed its anti-armor teams. Catching them before the window they had been preparing to open could be opened. Not by Teslin's documentation, which had already done its work. By the simple fact that Ashby had come up the slope alone and stood on a ridge and made a hand signal, and his men had gotten back in the vehicles. He had understood in the end that it was over. The package shook Holt's hand with both of his and said something the wind took, but the quality of it came through clearly. Gratitude, specific and earned. He got into the federal contact's vehicle, and the track took him down the mountain. Holt turned to find Teslin standing a few feet away, the federal agent having stepped back to give her a moment that the agent probably did not fully understand, but had correctly identified as necessary. She had removed the ghillie suit. Underneath it, standard cold weather base layers, worn and repaired in multiple places, with the careful mending of a person who had maintained what they had because there was no alternative. She looked less formidable without the suit, more human, more like the person he had known before the mountains took her and before she went back into them on purpose. She had the M2010 slung. The notebook was already in federal hands. She was carrying nothing that was not her own. He thought about what to say. 22 years of experience in situations where the right words mattered, and he had never learned to find them easily. He had learned instead to be honest in small amounts and let the honesty accumulate. The debrief is going to be significant, he said. Yes, she said. They're going to want everything. I know. She looked at him steadily. And there's the matter of my status, she said. I'm still listed as KIA. I was told that's going to create a significant administrative situation. I imagine it will, Holt said. Something that was not quite a smile crossed her face. It was in the same neighborhood as a smile. I told them that's their problem, she said. I did what I came here to do. The paperwork afterward is not my area. He understood this. She had been inside one thing for 4 years, and the thing was finished, and she was standing on the other side of it. The other side was not a destination she had prepared for, because preparing for it would have meant expecting to arrive. And expecting to arrive was the kind of weight she had not been able to afford. He reached into his jacket pocket. He felt the spent casing there. The one he had picked up from the granite shelf before dawn. The one he had been carrying since the beginning of this. He took it out and looked at it. The metal was warm now from being against his body all night. It was an ordinary thing. Brass, cylindrical. The neck expanded from the round that had been pushed down the barrel. There had been 3 of them originally, and he had taken one and left 2, and this was what remained of the first shot she had fired in his presence in 4 years. He held it out to her. She looked at it. She looked at him. Something moved in her face that was not the neutrality she carried most of the time. Something quieter and more complicated. Something that cost her in a way that the cost showed. She took it. She held it for a moment. Then she closed her hand around it and put it in her pocket, and the gesture had the quality of a person receiving something back that they had thought was lost. Not the casing itself, but the category of thing the casing represented. Proof of work completed, evidence that the long patience had come to something, confirmation that the account was settled. Thank you, she said. For what? He said. For following, she said. You were the right witness. He had nothing to add to that. He nodded, which was enough. Callum appeared at his shoulder. He looked at Teslin with the specific expression of a young soldier who has spent a night in proximity to someone he had treated as a legend and is now recalibrating legend against person. He said nothing. He gave her a single nod that had more in it than most speeches. She looked at him for a moment. You kept the knife safe, she said. Yes, Staff Sergeant, Callum said. The rank came out automatically, the rank she had held 4 years ago, before the paperwork had erased her, and neither of them acknowledged the strangeness of it, which made it exactly right. The vehicles were waiting. The mountain was turning gold at its peaks in the first full light of morning, the color moving down the ridgeline slowly, illuminating what the night had kept. The snow and the granite and the fir trees running in dark lines down the slopes, and the valleys between the ranges still in shadow, still holding the night in their lower reaches while the heights caught fire. Teslin stood at the top of the ridge for a moment and looked at it, all of it. The full scope of the terrain she had lived in, the mountains she had learned from the inside out, the range that had been her cover and her purpose and her world for 4 years. She looked at it the way you looked at something you had been inside long enough to know it completely and were now seeing from the outside for what might be the last time. Then she turned and walked to the vehicles. She did not look back. Holt stood on the ridge a moment longer than the others. He looked north, where the task force was moving, where the access roads were being secured, where the northern bunkers were being approached on coordinates that Teslin had gathered in the dark over 14 months. He looked at the range that had kept its secrets for 4 years and had finally been persuaded by the patience of one person in the cold to give them up. He thought about honor, not the formal version, the ceremony and the citation and the official language. The older version, the one that had no ceremony because it required no witnesses. The version that lived in the decision a person made when no one was watching and everything was very hard and they kept going anyway. The version that looked like nothing from the outside and cost everything from the inside. He thought about what it meant to serve, not the administrative meaning, the actual meaning, the weight of it, the demand it made and went on making even after the paperwork said otherwise. He thought about a woman who had decided, alone in the cold, that the paperwork was not the point. He put his hand in his pocket. It was empty now. He turned and walked to the vehicle. 3 days later, at Joint Base Lewis McChord, in an administrative building that smelled of old coffee and institutional carpet, Holt sat across a table from 2 debriefers who had been asking questions in a careful and methodical way for 6 hours. He told them everything they asked. Near the end, one of them looked up from his notes. The subject Teslin, during the period of your contact with her, did she express any intention regarding her future status or location? Holt thought about the ridge. The casing, warm from being against his body, passed from his hand to hers. The way she had not looked back when she walked to the vehicles. The particular quality of a person who had finished something and was now carrying only what was their own. No, he said, she didn't. The debriefer wrote something down. They moved on. Callum was waiting in the hallway when Holt came out. He fell into step beside him without being asked. They walked in silence down the corridor, past the doors with their official designations, past the window at the inn that looked out onto the flight line where aircraft were going about the ordinary business of a base that had not been in the mountains in January and did not know what the mountains in January cost. Do you think she'll be all right? Callum asked. Holt considered this with the seriousness it deserved. He thought about the woman he had known and the woman she was now. The distance between what 4 years did to a soldier who lived through them in a building and what it did to a soldier who lived through them alone in the Cascade Range, with a purpose and a rifle and the patience of someone who had decided that the work mattered more than the cost. Yes, he said, I think she will. He stepped out into the cold and let the door close behind him. The cold was ordinary here, flat institutional cold, nothing like the range. He stood in it for a moment and thought about ordinary cold and what it meant to know the difference. 12 days later at his desk, his phone showed a message from an unknown number. No text, one image, a photograph of a mountain ridge at sunrise, the peaks going orange and gold, the trees dark below, the sky above them a color that existed only at high altitude in winter before the light fully arrived. He looked at the photograph for a long time. He did not reply. There was no number to reply to. The message disappeared from his screen after 60 seconds, which was not a feature of his standard phone, which meant someone who knew how these things worked had wanted him to see one thing and only one thing, and had made certain he could not follow the thread back to its source. The mountains were still there. He already knew.